Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm returning to the subject of business ethics. My guest, Rupert Evill, is the author of a new book called Bootstrapping Ethics. While organisations might want to be ethical, or at least be seen to be ethical, after all, find me one that says they often don't know how to go about doing it. While larger ones can throw money at the problem and set up ethics functions, what can smaller organisations with limited resources or experiences do? As the title implies, Rupert's book is designed to help them think about ethics as something that, as with many other business dynamics, can be bootstrapped. In other words, you don't need lots of money or staff to be able to run an ethical business. If you've got limited resources, you need to be more resourceful on how you get the most out of them. As you'll hear, there are ways to creatively bootstrap ethics in even the smallest of organisations. In our discussion, we explore various ethical topics that Rupert is passionate about, including corruption, child poverty, human trafficking, and wildlife trafficking. And we hear of some of the creative ways he's looked to do that. Rupert's book is published by Wiley, which makes him a publishing stablemate of mine. That's the perfect excuse for me to remind you that my book, Humanising Rules, Bringing Behavioural Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out now. And if you order that and Bootstrapping Ethics, you'll not only have two books that complement each other in terms of subject, but they also look fabulous next to each other on the bookshelf. With all of that said, please enjoy a discussion with someone that always inspires me to think differently about the world, and I think he'll do the same for you. It's my conversation with Rupert Evill on Bootstrapping Ethics. Rupert, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm really excited to have you here. I know what you do, who you are and what you do, but some of my listeners might not have come across you. Can you give them a pen portrait?
Yeah, sure. So I'm accidentally in this line of work. I started out by taking a job I thought was more interesting than the alternatives, which was more to do with like crisis response, particularly at the terrorism and political violence. And then moved into investigations in about 2006, where that was partially sort of proactive, so due diligence, business intelligence, trying to work out people's backgrounds, but also the reactive stuff, particularly after the 2008 crash. And that work took me out to Southeast Asia in 2010, where my brief was to sort of build up the resources and assets around that region to help with sort of investigative crisis type of work. And what happened, I guess, in around 2011-12 was two things. Firstly, I felt deficiencies in my own investigative capacity. So I went back to further education and behavioral analysis with a focus on deception detection. And that sort of sparked a much more interest again, or brought me back to the beginning, why people do things. Because in counterterrorism, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at intention and capability. And then serendipitously around that time, clients started to sort of say, we're a bit tired of the whack-a-mole of responding to issues. Could we maybe try and work out how to avoid them? And that's sort of prompted a lot of risk assessment work. And I was working for Control Risk at the time, and they asked me to set up what they called their ethics and compliance consulting practice, which I did. And then I set up Ethics Insight in 2019 with a desire to maybe reach some of the people that are not particularly served for that sort of support and resources, because I work with a lot of people on the front lines in very complex emerging markets. And it was people who don't have infinite resources and big internal teams that I wanted to help.
When I look at what that involves, this is pure human behavior, right? Because when things go wrong, I always like to say when things go wrong, there's always human involved, either causing the problem or making it worse. So you've really seen, and I guess if you're in the preemptive stuff is one thing, but the sort of investigative piece afterwards, I mean, you're seeing really bad decision making happening.
Exactly, and I think that's the key. Is it's there's a presumption, I think, by some people that investigations means sort of hunting baddies, and I thought it was at the beginning of my career. But what I've come to realize, and this is just anecdotal and no science to back it up, but I reckon that the times where it's intentional sort of malfeasance and sort of willful ill-intentioned naughtiness is a very small minority of cases. The overwhelming majority is if you think about the fraud triangle, most organizations obsess about the opportunity bit. Where can we put in controls? The bits I'm far more fascinated by is the pressure and the rationalization. So there's the people being pressured to do things that they shouldn't, or feeling under pressure, creating that pressure, maybe poor planning, other things might lead into it. And then that rationalization piece, well, which can be anything from, well, if I didn't do it, somebody else would, or we would have lost the client, through to the sort of self-enrichment arguments. Well, these people pay me crap and I've worked my guts out for 20 years. So what's it matter if I skim my expenses? So that, that pressure and the rationalization bit, as you said, I think is overwhelmingly more interesting and more relevant. And it's sort of backed up by data. So the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, they do that annual report to the nations. And they did one a couple of years ago, and they were asking all these CFEs what was the primary cause of the fraud. And fraud is defined as a very broad church. And I think over 2/3 of cases, it was human override. So it wasn't a controls failure. It's so almost invariably, as you said, it's human decision making. So that's infinitely more fascinating than can we put in place a better expenses system? Yeah.
And my sense in hearing you and what I've read is there's a sense of curiosity here.
Yeah.
And sort of like, why is this happening? And a sense of sort of wanting to make the world a better place. What is it that drives your curiosity into people? Is that something that's always been there?
I don't know. I mean, I suspect if you ask my parents, I was probably that. Well, I know that what they'd say about sort of the colossally self-involved teenager. But I think, if I'm very honest, what started me in this line of work was the thrill of the chase, and knowing things that other people didn't know. And I do remember in my early 20s, kind of having a kick, when I'd be on the tube and thinking, I'm going to go to work and look into terrorism and get after action reports from ex-special forces guys. Isn't this sexy and exciting? And you're going to go and, move around spreadsheets. And so there was definitely ego involved. But as I've progressed and, had the sobering experiences of seeing how issues that can seem very remote, or I absolutely passionately hate the phrase white collar crime. Because corruption, for example, is classed as that. But when you see corruption upfront on, in terms of child poverty, human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, it's not a white collar crime. It's probably one of the most evil crimes out there. And so I think when I started to be exposed to that element is where, to use the common phrase at the moment, the ikigai came in, where it's like, okay, yeah, it's intolerable. If we can collectively push the needle a tiny bit and stop some of this stuff happening. And there was one moment that really, really sticks in my mind. So I was working with an Australian organization that was going through a pre-regulatory disclosure investigation. And we were traveling around their Southeast Asian subsidiaries, and that some of them were wonderfully managed. And there was great examples of leadership and people really owning it. And then there was one, the operations in the Philippines, where it was the opposite. And we walked in to do this risk assessment workshop, and it was a sea of folded arms, big burly Australians with lots of gold chains, all men, and then a couple of the sort of local females. And the leader came in and goes, "This is all important, guys. You've got to pay attention," and then walked out. And I was like, okay, so that's the tone here. And then for the first hour, we just had this is the way things happen here. This is what goes on in the Philippines, and all of that kind of stuff. And then the diminutive finance manager, she banged her hand on the table and stood up and she said, "No, you don't get it. I have to pay a bribe for the teacher to grade my son's paper. I get extorted at gunpoint as I drive down my road on the way to work by a cop who wants tea money. I can't get to see a doctor. We can't get proper medical care. If you're going to come to our country and benefit from it and extract resources, be they physical or human capital, the very least you can do is to try and bring better standards." And that also was a big shock for me because of, back in university, I'd studied all the ethnocentricity, cultural relativism, and I'd been very deferential in my time in Asia, thinking I shouldn't be going around telling people how to live and, what they should be doing in their countries. And then I sort of realized that, well, of course, no one wants to. The reason people migrate to the States and to the West is partially because of fair rule of law, better governance, these fundamental rights. And so it was one of those light bulb moments. I was like, oh, okay, that's my audience. My audience may seem like the internal in-house whatever, but the person I have in my mind is that lady.
Wow. very courageous, right, to say that. But I think it's cutting through. And what I think is fascinating about when we think about risks and when we think about ethics or all these topics, it's very easy to think in theoretical terms. But ultimately, as you've pointed out, there are human beings at the end of this.
Yeah.
And so whether we're looking at the drugs trade or whether we're looking at a bribery or any of these things, there is a human cost to all of this stuff. And that's not something that those of us living in Western countries are necessarily exposed to. We don't think it's happen. I mean, it happens here as well, but it happens in the underbelly. And what that, I guess the power of that conversation is just cut straight through, right? You're suddenly seeing the human cost of this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember you become inured to it a little bit. So I remember doing a big investigation of money laundering in Cambodia, which is one of the most dollarized countries in the world, also one of the most failed states, essentially. It's to put it in context, the prime minister, who's ex Khmer Rouge, has been in power pretty much unchallenged for decades and has a net worth estimated around $6 billion, but his salary is $3,000 a month. So he was once asked how he achieve such wealth, and he goes, good investment advice. And so I was taking a colleague who was new to the region and new to investigations, a Brit, on this project, along with a couple of other people, to sort of blood him against, essentially. And we were walking back through this market to our hotel, which, like most hotels that Westerners are staying, was quite nice. And he just stopped. And he recently had his daughter. I hadn't had kids at that time. And he looked around at these children begging on the streets, abject poverty, and he was like, all these things we've been talking about. And by the way, the Cambodia has everything from North Koreans through to Russians to Nigerian 419 scammers. Every organized criminal group is there. So we've been just pulling at this thread and staggered by the level of kind of corruption and money laundering. And he was just like, this is awful. And so you have these moments where you're like, yeah, that bring you back down to that makes something that can be quite dry when you're doing it, like I was yesterday, like setting out a risk assessment framework. And then you're like, okay, no, this is what we're trying to insulate and prevent and predict, etc. So yeah, it's important to, to use the Americanism to get your ass in the grass every now and again and actually have see how these issues rub up against people, but also to see the complexity. And I think that's something else on the other side, the more liberal-minded of us in the West can do well to remember, which is the solutions are very challenging. And I remember another case in Cambodia where that was brought home to me. There was an allegation on a UK respected paper that one of the sugar companies had been using child labor. And so then it was like, well, we better go and investigate, find out what's happening. And what happens is the sugar companies, they buy from wholesalers. This wholesaler happened to be in Thailand. They source from plantations around the region. And one of them was a very small plantation in Cambodia. And you get to that and there's no infrastructure. There's like barely roads, certainly no reliable electricity, nothing like daycare or anything like that. And so the people living in that agrarian environment, when they go to harvest, which is for the 3 months of the year, they take their children. And is that a safe environment for children? Absolutely not. The small ones are sitting around the edge where there's spiky things, and so it's dangerous. The ones that are, I guess, 10 and up are chopping with machetes. So it's a very arresting environment. But then if you stop dealing, the easiest thing, and I've seen it in Myanmar, is where people just retract because they don't want the regulatory censure or the news headlines. But does that actually help those people in that plantation? Not one iota, because worst case, they lose all their income. So-called best case at that juncture is someone else comes in to buy, and that someone else coming in to buy sure as hell's not going to have the same qualms that you might have done. So, but what do? Do you then do a CSR program for that one just to cover your butt? Do you do it across all of them? And so I think there's a level of intractability in some of these things that can seem a bit daunting, but it's important we have discussions on both sides of this is the reality. It's a complex thing to solve, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't all be trying to.
I think that urge to simplify things comes out in a lot of the work that I do as well, which is sort of, well, we need to have some rules in place. We need to codify. We need to solve the problem. Let's have a quick fix. And I see lots of parallels of sort of, here's a construct that we think is going to solve that problem or look like it's solved that problem.
Yeah.
And it might be a model. It might be it might be a sort of code of principles. And very often those things fail because they don't recognize the realities and they try and simplify highly complicated things. And I think when you talk in those terms, you're absolutely right. There isn't a perfect solution here,
No.
but sort of walking away from it, well, we're not doing any of that unethical stuff. You're absolutely right. Is that comes with a consequence as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I agree. I think the parenting helped me a lot because your kids dream up staggeringly stupid things to do or naughty things, and particularly my son, conforming to all stereotypes, and so you're faced with this: do I try and codify every possible violation, even ones that I never thought were like the like sticking your finger in the dog's bum? Like that was one of his projects at one juncture, and you think, well, no. So you having like long codified lists, and I think that's part of the curse of the compliance part that you and I work in, is that because its origins are legal, and case law in particular, there is a temptation to go, well, we've now found something new, let's add it to the kind of the list, or let's make a statute. And so rather than going, well, elevating and go, well, okay, well, what is the human issue here? What are the behaviors? What is the problem? What is the context? What are what's driving that? And then you find yourself getting back to values. And so I remember having a really good chat with a number of people, notably Alison Taylor, on the values topic, because I got a researcher to help me go through, I think it was like a good sample of the Fortune 500 codes of conduct, and then pull together their values. And then we created corporate bullshit bingo, because they're all the same. They're like, innovation, diversity, inclusion, excellence, customer centric, all this kind of stuff. And so we become inured to it and cynical. And so it's about that balance between having everything kind of codified and having frameworks. The analogy makes sense to me is your values should kind of be a tree, and on the branches you can hang the behaviors that you're looking for. And so that it's a constant challenge, as he said, but I think that's the interesting part to it. And I also, when we're talking about behaviors, one of the things I'm sort of experimenting with at the moment in terms of the risk assessment is most risk assessments they're basic audits, they're internal review of controls, and that's not particularly helpful. So it's trying to look at that external environment and the behaviors therein, and the internal environment. And so if we focus on, we talked a bit about the external already, on the internal bit, well, what are the issues here? And the themes I'm kind of lumping stuff together with, and they're clumsy, is it an understanding issue? And that extends just beyond pure comprehension. And I can give an example in a sec about Indonesia. It was really eye-opening about a failure to understand it, an intention. Is it an understanding issue? Is it an access issue? And that's not just about, the intranet looks like a teenager's bedroom after a burglary, which most of them do. But it's more, is this one good question to ask? Have you identified someone? I have identified someone that I can speak to, that I can share an ethical dilemma with. That's a good question about access within your organization. Is it an accountability issue? So unrealistic targets, bosses not willing to, bring me solutions, not problems, or is it a trust issue that I can't say that I don't know or I don't understand, I'm fearful of speaking up? And once we start to understand who within the organization has what problem, and it will differ, frontline folks in different countries may be very different to headquarters, but when we start to understand those behavioral drivers, then I think we're more likely to affect real change. And that to me is a more functional risk assessment than just, just ticking off, yeah, we have this policy, yeah, we've got this, yeah, we do the training once a year. Okay, great.
And I mean, that chimes beautifully with MySpace. Let's look at not MySpace, the site, as in MySpace, as in the work I do. And I don't know if MySpace is still around. Anyway, but I think looking at that realities of things. And so looking, I always talk about, look at what are people likely to do rather than what you would like them to do. Yeah. Because we can dream. There's all these sort of hypothetical, well, they've been on a training course, therefore they will understand it, be bought into it, blah, 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 blah. And that's just not the case. And you beautifully teed up the story about Indonesia, which we now have to hear. So talk us through that idea of understanding, because I think this is really important.
It was really, and it wasn't just one case, it was repeated, but the first one was Indonesia. So an American headquartered organization, but with UK exposure, were really getting racked with facilitation payments, which is, they're terrified by them because they're endemic in lots of industries.
Do you want to just explain what that is for listeners that haven't, because it's a euphemism for
something? Yeah, you're right. Yeah, small bribes to get something that you have a right to. So it's paying extra to make sure that your goods go through customs on timely fashion and unmolested. So that it's just you're paying to get something that you should, but paying the person directly over the odds, essentially. And so that those situations are actually set up. It's almost like tips in a way in many. Certainly environments I've seen in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South and Southeast Asia, where you have very underpaid officials who this is how they make their sort of extra money. And so very intractable problem again. But the message that had been hammered home by the in-house counsel in that operation was books and records, recording this stuff, terrible, going to look really bad. Now we have the UK Bribery Act. We can't be having facilitation payments on our books, and then don't do it. And so to an Indonesian audience, the other thing that people, I guess, when you travel around is, I'm sure you're familiar with Aaron Meyer's work, but what is the context of communication? Is this a low context or a high context country? Are people going to be reading between the lines and the subtext? And in much of Asia, it's high context communication. So people are often trying to read what is unwritten. And so the message they were hearing was not, the facilitation payments have to be phased out. It was, I don't want to see these written down.
No, recording.
And so what they did is they set up a very sophisticated fraud scheme with suppliers, where the suppliers would overcharge or double invoice, and then the money would go into literally a safe that would then be used to cash to continue the payments, because otherwise the operations would have ground to a halt. And so that nobody had their hands in the till. There was no self-enrichment. The fraud was entirely for the benefit of the organization. So it was being defrauded for its own benefit. And and then when this was uncovered, the shock amongst the local staff, like, what, you're going to be firing us? We were helping you. We're not benefiting here. If you really think that overnight you can turn off the tap and we're still going to have our licenses, our permits, our ability to get things through customs in timely fashion, our visas processed, that's not going to happen like that when you just suddenly turn off this tap. And so that was when that was probably the most sobering reminder that understanding intention rather than specific actions. And so there's lots of examples and I think there's one in the book about in Vietnam healthcare, where the poor legal counsel had to keep legislating things you shouldn't do with doctors because people just weren't getting, well, what's the intention here? Well, the intention is not to give some form of benefit to get a treatment that we shouldn't, in terms of the legal speak, but don't pay to get stuff you shouldn't. And the methods that you can do that are so incredibly creative that he just found himself writing "thou shalt nots" after every instance of an investigation. But yeah, so that understanding bit fascinates me when we aren't communicating intention properly.
And I think that's a really good illustration of a sort of, and I don't necessarily want to pick Western versus other cultures, but let's just sort of call head office logic.
Yes.
Where something gets concocted by someone that has never been in the field. And if you're lucky, the field is at least in the same culture.
Yes.
But we even see it within the same country. Something that's decided at boardroom level that makes no sense whatsoever on the ground.
Yeah.
That gets exacerbated when you have these cultural differences, linguistic differences, social norms, all of those things. And that's often forgotten. And so you get this, and let's be generous and say it's all well-intentioned decision-making from somewhere that then lands. And if you haven't understood what is going on the ground, and we can see that failure to understand what's going on, that's often the cause of failure of organizations.
Yeah.
That a blow up somewhere that was preventable if the right people had known about it and got to grips with the issue. And yet that, it happens more and more. We see this time and time again where you recognize that what you're trying to impose, doesn't matter how brilliantly thought out it is where you're sitting, has to resonate with the people on the ground. And you have to understand the conditions in which they're operating.
Exactly. And that's why one of the things I found really interesting since stepping out to run my own business is I come into contact with people who speak languages I never knew existed, like design thinking, user experience, all this kind of stuff, like when you speak to a website developer. And so I made a few friends through, during COVID, through various networking groups, including a lot in Australia. And one of them, they do sort of gamified e-learning, but specifically targeted at mobile devices, because in Australia you have logistics and mining and infrastructure and retail, where not only these people are very seldom at a laptop, but many of them are contract labor anyway, so they're not even on company email. And so for health and safety in particular, how do you reach these folks? And so when I saw this stuff, it was really cool. And it reminded me of when a previous employer where they'd rolled out I think it was like cyber awareness training. And I was it was that trip to Cambodia, and we were then on Blackberries. And the chap I was there with, he had a background in sales, and he was like, "Just look at this." And he showed it on the screen, and it didn't display properly. You couldn't even read the full sentences of the cyber security instruction, and because it wasn't optimized for that device. And I remember, and that came flooding back. And we've recently done some assessments, and what's been very interesting is it's when you say it out loud, you're like, yeah, no, well done, common sense. So you went and did a study to arrive at common sense. But we did this study, and what we found was the frontline people, sales, operations, understanding and access is weakest, because you're not reaching them often in a medium that's helpful. And then you start to read about memory, which is one of the things I studied during those postgrad studies, which was fascinating, and also the Hubbard Ebbinghaus and the forgetting curve and spaced repetition, all that kind of stuff. So we're asking them to come into the office begrudgingly, or some sort of porter cabin on site, and then click through some e-learning, and then that's job done. And so but then what was fascinating was at headquarters, that was where trust was lowest. So the closer you were to the seat of power, the least trust you had in it. And so when I started to get all this information, it's like, this is it's finally usable data. Now we know who needs what and how we need to reach them, and what sort of empathy and to genuinely to sympathize, empathize with their plight and their situation, and start to create content and ways of reaching them. And so I find that side of things really very interesting.
For me, the bit that astonishes me is we all know this intuitively. Back to kids, when we're at school, you have teachers that are really good at exciting you about the subject. And I always think the teachers that are brilliant are the ones that have a subject that's possibly a little bit more dull, but who somehow make it come alive. And then you've got the opposite end of the spectrum, which is the ones who've got the best possible raw materials, who somehow manage to make it dull, and who teach to the syllabus and frankly shouldn't be teaching. And it just seems to me that we all, if we think back to our school days, most of us are lucky enough to remember one or two teachers who really stood out, who were just awesome, who cared, who taught outside the syllabus, and who just and got to us on some level. And that may have influenced what we studied later on. It may have influenced things we're interested in now, but they succeeded, and the other ones didn't. And so I find it astonishing when we know that we've been through that experience, and yet what we see happening in the adult world is the equivalent of those appalling teachers. Is we sort of, you will be interested in this because it's important. Well, I will if you tell me why it's in my interest to be. Is it going to save my life?
Exactly.
Right? Or is it going to be a big pain in the butt and something tedious? And to your point, dragging people who don't normally sit in front of a laptop to sit, just that act, before you've even put anything on the screen, screams, I couldn't care less about your thing. You are going to come to my world as opposed to me coming to yours. And I think, that what bothers me about it is that we all intuitively know this. That teacher example illustrates this perfectly. We understand it. And somewhere that goes missing in the adult world.
Well, that's you're very welcome to. My greatest muse for a lot of my work is my 12-year-old daughter, because she has a staggering. I remember her most withering comment, which was about facilitation payments, where I was I was working with an organization, and they had one in a training session. They were determined to get across the construct of facilitation payments, and so I always showed her material, and her comment was, I understand each of those words on their own, but the way they're put together, just no. And and it's that sort of, you silly adult, and so you're entirely right. And I think and also you drag people off the site and you put them in the porter cabin and make them click through the thing, and then you don't give them any kind of break or time off for that, so they then have to go back down the mine or onto the construction site and work harder. But the other bit I found very interesting, coming from that sort of terrorism crisis thing, where often it's a very reactive mode, so decision making has to be sharp and acute, into the compliancy stuff, was the endless desire to explain the inner workings of things that don't matter to people. So if you think about like cybersecurity, they don't tell you. Well, thankfully, I've not experienced it. Where if you stick in a thumb drive, this is the electronic function that's happening, and this is how the data extract. They just like don't do it. And I saw a good cartoon about that, which is you wouldn't pick gum off the street and put it in your mouth, so don't stick an external device into. I was like, okay, that's a pretty that sticks with me. I've remembered that. Whereas in the compliance stuff, you often so many training sessions that I've sat through or seen, it's like a bit like South Park. I'm going, here's Mr. Garrison. He's going to talk to you about the FCPA, and he's going to talk to you about the UKBA now, and maybe SAPA, and then we're going to talk about how they're different and the things they do and don't cover. You're speaking to an audience of business developers. You've spent like 45 minutes talking about, and to your point about health and safety, I like good health and safety because it's so simple. It's like wear a hard hat or you might die. Okay, that's
Right.
useful. So don't pay bribes, you might go to jail. So that's the call to action, and it's something I've really had to learn in my own business. And I'm not very good at still, which where I have to surround myself with people who are much better. Is I can be tempted to go, this is why this is important, this is cool, and they're like, where's the call to action? That leads. That has to lead. What is it you're trying to get people to do here? And if that isn't front and center and abundantly clear, then you failed.
Spend a ton of time talking about things that we don't need to waste time on. So there's a lot of the equivalent of, the sort of the warnings you get on coffee cups, right? Which is there because somebody once put a cup of coffee in their crotch and drove at high speed down the motorway. So we need to warn everybody this cup of coffee. And I understand
Peanuts,
why that happens.
Nuts.
Right. Yeah. And you should just go like they clearly think I'm an idiot, and we're wasting valuable time and attention on stuff that does. And so I always think, training, let's focus on the things that if somebody's natural behavior is likely to be the sort of behavior that we're looking for, then we can probably spend less time on that, if any, than on the things where what we want them to do is weird and unusual and we are pain and may not be obvious to them.
Yeah.
And so this really thinking about the attention that you're trying to grab, and to your point, what do you want me to do with it?
Yeah.
I don't need to know the genesis of a regulation.
Yeah.
Unless the genesis is useful to me in understanding. But we get this sort of, right, we're going to teach you about the blah, blah act. That just means nothing to me. I don't care. I'm not interested. If I was interested in rules, I'd be working in compliance.
Yeah.
Right? I'm interested in sales or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
And I think that grabbing the audience thing is absolutely critical. And I love the way that you talk about it, because it's very, in the loosest possible sense, it's very user friendly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm like everything. I think the best teacher is failure. And so I don't know what your experiences have been of running your own business, but mine have been brutal in the best possible way. And that there's sort of endless teachers of everything that you do and don't want. So, for example, I remember the first interactions with prospective accountants, and the ones who I just were speaking in gobbledygook. I was like, okay, this is not going to help. I'm almost entirely financially illiterate, and so I needed to have somebody then just say to them, like, explain it to me like you would a 9-year-old. And then the people, I've always loved having those people around. And so I remember like years and years ago when the Hadron Collider came out, I was lucky enough to meet a physicist, and I was like, I don't understand this God particle stuff. Can you explain it? And I can't now recall how they did it, but they did it in such a way that I was like, oh, okay. And so I have terrific empathy with people not getting stuff that other people are interested in, and and also I still need constant shaking out of that curse of knowledge. There are certain things that you just take as sort of implicit that to other people are really aren't. And I remember having to write about it in the book, particularly conflicts of interests, is a very good topic, and I understand why it promotes so much discussion, because I remember years ago going to New Zealand, which is obviously the most den of iniquity, incredibly high risk environment. And normally when you go to do sort of like compliance training, as you know, that people aren't exactly sort of hoisting out the bunting. And but we went in and everyone was like looking fresh-faced and enthusiastic, and it's this tiny town in New Zealand, and they said, at our it's in the city, but some of the sites were at very tiny towns, and they said, at our smallest site, it is impossible for us not to be hiring numerous relatives, because they're the only people that can provide the things that we need, because they're like doing heavy equipment manufacturing and stuff. And how do we deal with that? And they genuinely wanted to find out. And so to your point, some topics are pretty self-evident. Don't steal. Okay, do we need to spend a lot of time doing asset misappropriation? Oh, the terminology we come up with. This is petty larceny. You're like, okay, so we've got lots of names for it. That's good, but don't steal. We've covered it. But then something like a conflict of interest, particularly in very familial societies, to say, if you give work to the people that you like and you think are good at the job, that may be breaking our policies. How do we do that? How do we continue? And then you just remove yourself from the process, you declare. And so then this prompts conversations about language, which I also find fascinating. So I spoke to an ex-colleague who's now doing in-house sub-Saharan African focused work, and she said that the conflicts of interest, using the word conflicts of interest in sub-Saharan Africa is obviously quite loaded terminology as well. So it was about just unburden yourself about relationships you have outside that may overlap. And so just talking about what it is, it's relationships and where do they intersect with our work. And that constantly checking your programmed rubbish that you have, that you think is great, and that you're inflicting on someone else, and they're just wanting it to end. And there's nothing like it. Again, my daughter is as I will sometimes show her my presentations, and she'll be like, and so like, which bit would you cut? And she goes, well, that's boring. That needs, what about? And so she gave me a great one recently, which was very arresting. I was trying to I'm going to be running a session on how you qualify threats, the external baddies, the corrupt politicians, all that kind of stuff. And so I was talking about how we sometimes overstate things that cause some sort of almost amygdala response, and then massively underestimate. And she goes, well, give an example of that that everyone would get. And so we just put a picture of a tarantula and a mosquito on the slide. The tarantulas don't kill anyone, but most of us don't really want to be around one, and will react in a very... Mosquitoes kill 2 to 3 million people per annum. So I'm very grateful for anyone I can bring into my orbit who will help you go, what is it you're actually trying to communicate here, and in a way that might be memorable.
Speaking of communication, you've mentioned it a few times, so let's get on and talk about the book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Talk a little bit about why you came to write it, because I think it's very personal, and you talk a lot about your experience, but just talk us through that.
Because I was asked to. No, honestly, it wasn't something that was in a plan. And when I was approached about it, I was like, I don't know whether I can do this. And my wife was like, don't be an idiot. You've got to do this. This will be useful and instructive, if nothing else. And she said
you might learn something.
Yeah, exactly. And then it was what do you want to write about? I was like, I thought you were going to tell me that. And then so I was given a relatively cleanish slate, and I thought, well, how would I sum up the two things we've just been talking about? Well, most of the people I work with don't have huge resources, huge internal teams. They're often solo contributors. Maybe they're new into that role, and they're trying to build that kind of capacity. And that's exactly the experience that I've had in my business. I've been bootstrapping. I've been building it myself by trying to do things competently that then will afford you greater resources to do things more competently. And so that's the route that they're pursuing. And so I'm starting also to have these, as I meet other people running smaller organizations, I'm starting to have a lot more empathy as well for them coming to these issues. So I had that person in mind, the person whose organizations, maybe medium, and it's starting to go well, and they're like, oh, okay, now we need to deal with this stuff, but where do we start? And I think that where do we start thing is so overwhelming and that I hugely empathize with, because particularly when I met my wife, she thought I was a fraud initially because I had no social media profile whatsoever. I was loving my time in the shadows doing all this spooky and investigative work. And so I am and was very marketing stunted. And so I was highly impressionable, and I went around reading blogs, and some was like, it's cold outreach, it's got to be, the emails and the click-through rates, and I was reading all about that. And then, oh no, it's LinkedIn adverts, or it's got to be organic growth, and it's got to be and so I started it, opened every social media account for the business, did a terrible job across all of them because I wasn't sort of able to focus and understand who lives there. And that's the experience for a lot of people with risk, is like to give one example, which I have used before. A friend in Australia, the one who has that really cool e-learning company, called up one day and said, I need an anti-corruption management framework. I was like, what? And it's subscription-based, all domestic, no governmental interactions. They don't. It was COVID. They weren't even meeting clients for any gifts or other things. I was like, I'm trying to understand and diagnose where this exposure was and where this. And I said, why now? Why this? And they said, oh, the bank have told us. I was like, oh, okay. So this is just cover your ass territory. Fine. Well, we'll do something for that. But what about data privacy and cyber? Because you hold hundreds of thousands of people's personal details now. And they're like, oh, I think we'll get insurance for that. And it wasn't like ill intention. It wasn't they were negligent. It's just they were following what other people have been telling them to do. And so, yeah, the book was trying to write to that person that's finding their way through a topic that is very inaccessible for most people, and for two reasons. It's not super easy to research, but also there's a lot of very expensive law firms and other advisors. But if you're a medium-sized organization, or even some of the larger ones at the moment, particularly with the economic strictures, you don't have boundless cash to go and let somebody run around your organization doing some big mapping of your potential exposure.
I loved about it was just, as you say, it's practical, but it's also it's highly realistic about what can happen. And so you're thinking, it's bringing exactly the thoughts of things we're talking about here. Is we might need to have something to tick a box somewhere, as you say. And you'll have this, I get this, where I'm sort of asked for my human risk. What's the human risk policy on blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to write a policy for myself, but okay, you need me to have a policy that talks about, diversity policy. It's kind of difficult when you come with one, but I have one, right? Because I had to produce it somewhere to tick a box somewhere. But it does start me think, so when I look at that situation, yes, I'll give you the piece of paper to keep whoever it is happy.
Yes.
But in reality, but what's a more important question to me is how do I bring cognitive diversity and different approaches into my organization?
Yeah.
That's a valid risk that I ought to be managing. The sort of what's my recruitment policy? It's just a little bit less relevant when you're not recruiting. But I think that's what I loved about your approach. It's recognizing the realities of things. And I think the bootstrapping is a beautiful analogy, because actually when we look at the rest of, how do startups operate, it's a bit of hustling and making up as you go along and try this and do that. And so I don't think that there's any reason why you shouldn't take that same approach with things like that and just go, how can we achieve this with the resources that we have in a reasonable, sensible way, and recognize that some things may have to wait until we're bigger.
Yeah.
But let's do what we can with the resources that we have. So I love this bootstrapping analogy, because I think it's always like, well, if you're not doing it properly, then you're not doing it at all. And it's this binary thing. If you have to have a massive amount of machinery that's just disproportionate, that you wouldn't have for anything else.
Well, exactly. And so as you probably worked out by now, I love like torturous analogies. And when I think about best practice, what it comes to my mind is like, if you, we're both in England, and if you design a best practice security guide for public facing premises on a high street, you might think, okay, a bank, let's pick that because it's holding lots of cash. And then, so that's the best practice. And then that's what you then inflict on a charity shop or, a donut, a cafe. And so they're going, well, where's our vault? But what about the perspex screens with do we need to have the alarm? And so this is to your point, this is exactly right. It should be something you build bespoke to you as you progress. And it also should match and mirror your risk appetite and who you want to be out in the world. And I don't know about you, but I'm reaching that stage in life where even if people are profound, if their views are ones I really don't like or diametrically opposed to mine, if they're honest and they own them, it's at least I have more respect. And so,
Yeah.
having worked with a lot of, particularly the big banks, what I saw there is CYA completely, and not a caviar, so not a because it's become so siloed and programmatized. So there's no shame in saying that our values is about making lots of money and risk is relatively low down our list of priorities, because that would be more honest. But nobody obviously can say that because there's regulators, and then you have to attract talent, blah, blah, blah. But I did have in mind, and I tried to write the book not as some sort of sanctimonious preaching of what I think a corporate utopia should be, but just being realistic about the impact you can have and the things that matter to you. So if treating people matters hugely to you, then you should focus on the psychological safety aspects of your environment, etc. If it's about minimizing your impact in the environment, then start there. And obviously resources are finite, so there's certain elements that are going to be subordinate to that. And I think that would ultimately, I think, probably affect better change if we just tried to focus on the small things that we really care about. But I do realize we're talking in very conceptual terms, because most large organizations, certainly they have to sign off every year saying they're in compliance with this, that, and the other, which then I think is very undermining of the conversation we need to have. And I remember years and years ago, a big Danish company, their general counsel at a conference was asked about small bribes. And he said, we're working towards zero tolerance. There's no way we're kidding ourselves into thinking that we're there. And everyone's like, oh, he said it. He said out loud what everyone else knows. And I just wish we could, because to get to that position requires so many strands of society, civil society, G2G, donors, all of these people to come together and actually put in place the structures. And so I'll give you one example that really brought it home. So I was working with an Aussie miner in Indonesia, and after the Bali bombing, the Indonesian authorities really clamped down on commercial explosives. And so at that time, only two agents in the whole of Indonesia were had the import license for commercial explosives. And they're only coming to Tanjung Priok port in Jakarta. And then they have to be escorted by elite police units or outriders to wherever the mine was. And so it's a messy archipelago. So those journeys can go on days and days and days. And but there's no mechanism for paying those cops for the service that they're provided, nor accommodation, meals. There's nothing codified. So technically, you're kind of just paying them cash to do a job that they are providing you a service. And when you're dealing with that level of kind of grayness, which is much of the world, I wish we would have more of a. We're on the path. We're trying to work towards, but there's not that easy.
But I think that's a really, really good example of where, if you pretend that something is the case, we never make mistakes in this organization. We have an omniscient leader who gets everything right. We never break any laws. Every single employee is 100% ethical. Right? It's palpable nonsense. And anybody that says that outside organizations, you find yourself in North Korea very quickly, right? We laugh at those things. And I find it interesting that organizations, you don't want to open yourself up to legal liability. You don't want to upset regulators. But I think if you really want employees to focus on things, then at least moving towards what you're talking about, let's have honest conversations about things that are a bit difficult.
Yeah.
And stuff that's not straightforward, and recognize that there's trade-offs here, right? As you put, the classic one for me is always the sort of ethics versus revenue.
Yes.
Right. So let's be honest about that. And rather than saying, well, we're very ethical and we want to make tons of money, there's going to be how do we help people who find themselves at that apex? And if our incentive programs drive you to keep let's just be even more basic than make a bonus. To keep your job, you have to do a certain amount of sales, but we also want you to be ethical.
Yeah.
Well, at some point, those two things are going to rub into conflict with each other.
Yeah.
So I think pretending that they don't, and sort of go, this is all very, and then that feeds into training as well, where you get black and white scenarios. My favorite one in banking was always, you're in a meeting with a client and the client's sister has walked in with a suitcase full of money. What do you do? Or gold bars, something weird. And you sort of sit there and go, no one needs help with that situation because they'll sit there and go, this is a bit weird. Let me pick up the phone.
Yeah.
That's not a situation we need to spend a massive amount of time on because it's bloody obvious.
Yeah.
The challenge is that difficult that people might not recognize it, might not be aware of it, might be tired, not thinking, never have seen it before,
Yeah.
feel under pressure. We should talk about those things. And that's where I think to your point is, yes, I get that larger organization, there is a lot of reporting and there's a lot of performative theater that has to be gone through. But I think if you start with a dishonest dialogue, which ultimately it is, if you pretend that these things are easily solvable, then of course you're not equipping people to go out in the world and do the right thing.
Yeah. 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 And no, I agree. And there's but I think the other bit we're that is we're potentially missing that sometimes there are those quick wins. So I had a conversation earlier this week with we're doing a risk assessment, and the internal team are a bit concerned, like, what if should all the high risk ones be treated within a certain time period? What medium ones should we give a time period to it? And now I was like, no, because you're actually going to be setting yourself up for a worse situation than you should, because there will be some where it's say it's a medium risk, but you can just square it off in a matter of minutes. It's something that, we should have put that in place, or we didn't think about that, or we'll just add that. And whereas there are others that are never fixed, like the classic one would often be, gifts, hospitality, and entertainment. Because if you as an organization are going to continue to interact with customers in a certain way, then the idea that you can solve that and that challenge, but the solution is often incredibly, that can be relatively simple. So there was an organization I was dealing with recently where the senior manager had walked in late to a dinner meeting, and it was already well out of hand. Expensive bottles of wine being ordered by the clients, huge numbers of people there on their side, including spouses, all the classic stuff. So what's the solution to that? And they immediately like, well, were you telling us we can't take the clients out anymore? It's like, no, you just it's very simple. It's planning. If you're going to entertain that client, you obviously make sure about the perception. It's not round about the time you're trying to get them on board for a big contract, or let's say it's an annual thing. Then you choose the venue, and you speak to the venue first about the menu and what can and can't be ordered, and that's and you set a limit to it, and then you invite the client along. Go, here's the food we've ordered for you. Here's some drinks, etc. It's a done deal. And if they order anything else, you just have to have that difficult conversation. And go, I'm sorry, but this is, we've already exhausted our da da da. But it's most of the time that's not really going to happen. So it's just you get out of that, that spiral of endless tedium about, well, can I do this? Can I do that? Can I do that? So just take control of the situation. If you absolutely have to take them out, take control of the situation, then you don't have a problem. And so I think, when we tie ourselves a lot in knots when we could just be. And I think to go back to where we started, I think nobody wakes up wanting to be the villain. And so we just have to give people a bit of a nudge and help and guidance to bring the person they want to be to work. And we see this in data, like the Nordic Business Ethics Survey a couple of years ago. They had a good question about what caused you to compromise your own ethics, and number one reason I was told to. So the people know they're compromising their own ethics, and that's your point about the targets and all the rest of it. So we just have to dial it back in to focus around the individual, which is obviously what you're doing with human-centric things centered around them, and stop treating people like they're, to go back to the school thing, that they're naughty and quite stupid children. They're not.
And here's the thing, right? If they are, why have you hired? Right? If the raw materials are that bad, there's something wrong with your recruitment process. So we have to assume that the vast majority of people walking through our doors, either digitally or physically, good people trying to do the right thing, if they're given that opportunity and the right incentives are put in place. Yes, there's a small percentage of people that might be joining your organization to get up to no good, but that's a separate problem.
It is.
Because, as I always say, they don't listen to training. Right? If they're paying attention in training, it's to find loopholes. So they shouldn't be the target audience, because if you target those people, you're sending a signal to everybody else that they're like them.
Yes.
And that, we all know, and I find it fascinating looking at sort of other situations in which I get pissed off. If I have a crappy customer experience somewhere, or I'm made to do some tedious government bureaucratic process, visas is always the one I talk about. I have no choice. If I want to go into a particular country and I need to fill an immigration form that I think is done, they can get away with that up to a point, but that's a different scenario. Employment situations, I have a choice of different people I can work for. And if you irritate people,
Yeah.
either you lose your talent or they will find ways of getting back at the machine.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's my yeah, so there's my daughter. My daughter's spending a bit too much time on social media, but sometimes that's quite funny. And so she sends me these memes, and there's one recently of a chap being interviewed. I don't know if it's fake or not, but he's been interviewed. Not interview. He's having his annual appraisal, and he set up the video himself. You can just hear the HR person on the thing, and she says, um, we've noticed that your performance has dipped and that you're not, I think it'd be fair to say, there's lots of euphemisms, you're not making as much effort as you once were. And I can't think off the top of my head, but all of those kind of management isms were coming in about how can we best, optimize your potential, this type of stuff. And he just sort of nodding, and he said, well, so in 2 years, I've not had, as you said, 3 years ago, I completely aced it. That resulted in no discernible improvement in my lot. So last year I continued to try and work hard, and then same. And then I realized that actually, if I do a rubbish job or a great job, it has no discernible impact on me in terms of progression, pay, anything like that. So I decided to just fulfill my contract. And then there's this silence of the, and I think that's the other bit that is uncomfortable that with what we do, which is to, that all these surveys come out about employee engagement. Only 50%, 49% of people are happy in their jobs, and I think we always have to be mindful when we go into any situation where we're meeting those people that we really have a lot of ground to cover to generate trust and respect and goodwill with them, because they're already not feeling great and they're possibly under lots of other pressure. And my brother always says that whenever you meet, he's always reminding me of the kids, whenever you meet someone, assume that they're in pain. Not because of some negativity, but we're all carrying things with us in our personal and private life. So if I'm going to ask you to do stuff that's potentially really difficult, so I'm going to ask you I love the example you use, to be ethical whilst hitting ridiculously ambitious targets in an economic downturn. If I come in particularly if I'm an external consultant in suit and I come in and talk to you like that, how's that going? So I just some, and this is the greatest learning I had from that further studies. I went in there wanting to be a better investigator. And my mentor, who sort of helped sponsor my, after he saw what he felt was potential, Cliff Lancey, is a wonderful man. He told me years later, he said, no, the more important thing, the journey for you is I thought that this would be good because it would, it's the EQ side that is potentially the more important superpower to work on. I can teach you to be a good investigator and ask questions and spot behavioral clues, but the benefit is going to be way more than that very small niche of what you do. And I was thinking about writing a post that I haven't got around to about, asking people what skills, soft or otherwise, would they like to invest in to be better at their jobs in this risky compliance thing. And I couldn't really write it because I was just writing it with a skew towards that, because that's what I feel that if we did have a huge dose of EQ, we might affect a considerably better outcome, because we're asking a lot of people, and a lot of those people are profoundly underutilized or feeling underappreciated by their employer, and that I think we have to remember.
It's fascinating when you work for yourself because you have no excuse, right? You said the terms of trade, so you better create a work environment that's pleasurable, joyful. Otherwise, you can fire yourself, I guess. But I think it is interesting when we look at what work could mean, and it actually does mean in reality. And I think when we look at recruitment processes for firms, particularly larger ones, all the right things are said. Right? Nobody's going to say, "Come and work for us. It's bloody awful, and we're going to waste your time and make you do loads of boring things." And it's all sold in a particular way. And so we know that that's what, in theory, attracts people to work.
Yeah.
And yet in reality, and again, it's about looking at what's the reality of what's going on. And I think it's very, very easy sometimes to sort of ignore, that's a bit difficult. But if we treated the world like it was this way, we could simply codify things and we could solve a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we just have to lift that rock up or open the door, whatever they and just say, well, what's actually going on, and what can we do with the realities that's there? And to your point, I really like your message about it is not about chasing the perfect. Let's not pretend that we're going to nail everything. I talk about compliance, and I say 100% compliance with a particular thing. Right? It is always possible, but you have to throw the kitchen sink at it to make it happen. And that comes at a cost, right?
Yeah.
So if it's sort of let's stop people being killed on a building site, maybe it's worth doing.
Yeah.
But there are lots of other situations where you say, well, look, we would like everybody to meet kids with it. What Yuval Feldman calls the more the merrier. Right? The more people we have doing this, the better. And so if we look at that as an objective, we say, let's be realistic about what's there. And then we start to work out what really matters. And not all rules are made equal. Not all issues are that cause the same problem. And so it's not black and white, it's gray. And let's think in those terms. Then we can start to improve the world. If we're just pretending that we've got this, we're back in the world of North Korean factories that are producing things and we know what happens in those scenarios.
Yeah. And so that I think I used an analogy to North Korea when I said, when you hear we have zero tolerance for this, we have 100% compliance, all this kind of stuff, the only people who say that are people like North Korea. And so it's a pretty intimidating thing. And also the zero tolerance thing, I've ranted about it numerous times, because not only does I think in some people's heads it sets a very unrealistic prosecutorial bar. As you'll know, there's many cases where you can't prove the wrongdoing even if you know it occurred. And so if you say we have zero tolerance and somebody does something terrible, but you can't pin it on them, and then they're walking around in the office, you lose a huge amount of trust amongst people.
Yeah.
I think it sets that from that angle, it's problematic. But it's also it's so it can disincentivize people coming forward with things that really do need to be addressed, but maybe not with the severity. So one of the examples I gave was, and it's loosely based on reality. I anonymized it a bit, but it was in South of America, southern US, and a black gent joined the team, so construction kind of stuff, and every Friday, the rest of the team was still going out and they never invited him. And so if you had zero tolerance for discrimination, that would seem like fairly clear. But when people actually spoke to him, he didn't want to come forward and have them face sanction, because what he felt, and was proven to be the case, is they went to some good old boys honky, country and western bar, and they didn't think he'd want to come. It wasn't that there wasn't a lot of malice that could be determined there. It was very clumsy, but in that situation, that person's just sitting there feeling excluded, discriminated, but not wanting to come forward because of the potential disproportionate effect on people who otherwise are nice colleagues to work with. And so, for many reasons, I think it's very challenging to say that we are completely intolerant of X and Y. I think like everything in humanity exists on a spectrum and a scale. And I think we have to there's a former colleague of mine, Dane Shamora, who had a good way of explaining it. He said you're looking for the broken windows and graffiti first as the indicators of sort of decay within that community. And then you're working from that to try and improve from that ground up. So it has to have that kind of social intervention aspect as well as the enforcement bit. And that is a big challenge for particularly the solo contributors, because you're asking them to be the educator, the counselor, and the enforcer. And that's that's very challenging. So which then goes back to one of the reasons when I was writing the book, is I just wish the organizations had moved to a position where risk ownership is more shared. It's a team sport, and it sits with some of the people who actually face it, rather than what I've seen in particularly organizations that have gone through or are going through big regulatory action, is you almost have an infantilization of the population, where these massive compliance teams and monitors and everything come in, and then people devolve all decision making to them on any topic because they're just too terrified of making it. And then then you wonder why everyone ends up absolutely hating the compliance program, the business stops performing, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very self-defeating. Whereas if you're wanting to cure a malaise within any community, you have to do the social work as well as the invigilating and education. And I think that's I know that's an area you're focused on, but there's not that many people as squarely focused as you are on that behavioral human side of it. And I wish there were more.
On that positive, well, it's a note for the future, I think. I could keep talking to you forever, but unfortunately, time is against us. Before I let you go, Rupert, reminds me what the book is called and how they can get hold of you. I'll put links to all of these things in the show notes.
Oh yeah, it's called Bootstrapping Ethics, and the LinkedIn is where I'm most active. So that would be the easiest place to find me. And yeah, they're very happy to field questions, take challenges, or anything that I've said. Because one of the things I've enjoyed, particularly, I don't know about you, but since going out on in smaller businesses, you seem to become a lot more accessible to people to ask you and want to have a chat. Like I had a chat with somebody last week who works in the Red Cross, and they're trying to build some sort of framework, and they showed me what they were doing. And it's just nice. I would not have had those when you're in a bigger organization where you become, I think, a bit more unapproachable. So very happy to have discussions with people.
Love that. I think, based on the conversation that we've had and the other conversations you and I have had, you'll be back on the show hopefully at some point soon. But in the meantime, links to the book, which is highly recommended, otherwise you wouldn't be here, and you in the show notes. But all that remains to say is, one, thank you for all the things that you do, because you've always inspired me, and I enjoy reading the things that you put out. That's very, very helpful. But most importantly right now, thank you for being a great guest on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Rupert for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Rupert and his book, Bootstrapping Ethics, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. There's also a link to my book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, which, as I said at the outset, sits nicely alongside Rupert's on the bookshelf. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you've missed any of the previous episodes, you can find them all at humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe. Remember that ethics, like anything else in business, is something you can bootstrap. And thank you so much for listening.